far in beautiful northern Utah. We're bombing along here at about 80 miles an hour. We have the Banks gauge in this Jeep, but I don't have it plugged in because I'm using the torque app. I have the torque app pre-configured, and I'm going to say there's a few things about this Banks gauge that we want them to improve, and we are actually working with them on that. One is that you can't scan or clear codes while you're moving. In fact, you're restricted from doing a lot of things while you're moving. This Jeep is getting pretty good mileage. We're at 246 miles and we still have almost a quarter of a tank. So we're gonna hit 300 miles with this tank, which is gonna put us right around 15 to 16 miles to the gallon. Now I am cruising at about 80 miles an hour. If we had slowed down, that would be even better economy. Plus, notice we're turning about 2,400 RPM at 80. We want to see that less. We want to see about 2,200 RPM at 80, maybe 2,000 RPM or lower at 70. And I've got guys that go completely the other way, 373s with 37-inch tires, and they're turning 1,700 RPM at 80 miles an hour. And those guys are seeing even better economy. But don't be fooled. It's not just about gearing. It's about the weight of your JK, the lift on your JK, aerodynamic drag. There's a lot of other factors that come into play, and the fuel that you run. And I know a lot of us are compromising on fuel right now because of the prices. We were just down in California. It was over $6 a gallon. Up here in Utah, premium's running $5 a gallon. So on some of these engines, I've been running regular and mid-grade. Now the LT1, which this vehicle has, does not like to run on mid-grade, so we're going to run premium in this one. But you know, while 60 miles to the gallon isn't the best, I've seen a lot worse. This Jeep is interesting because it came from back east. I'm not sure, Ohio, Jersey, I don't know. It's somewhere back where they use salt on the road. And when this Jeep came in and we pulled the body, the frame was horrible. The frame was rotted. In fact, it was a see-through frame. You could look right through the frame because it was rotted so badly. And not only was the frame rotted badly, but so was the steering gear and pretty much anything that wasn't protected with a special coating was rotted. Even the differentials were rotted. We had to change the steering gearbox. We went to a PSC. Now this customer apparently is going to upgrade his axle, so he'll install the RAM at some point. And while we're talking about the PSC RAM, let me expand on that a second. A lot of guys buy the XD box and they ask, will it fit? Well, it will fit with some and actually all of our conversions, depending on how much work you want to do. If you're running an LT1, it's just going to fit. One of the other variables is there were different XD boxes. I remember some of the earlier ones had 4-bolt covers on top and they were a smaller diameter. The later ones seem to have 6-bolt covers and they're huge, like out of a 1-ton truck. Now on top of the size of the XD box, what engine do you have? If you have an LT1 like this, there is no vacuum pump down there. There is no AC compressor down there. So in most cases, the XD box fits with no modifications. If you have an LS engine, that's where Jeep puts the AC compressor, and that's where we put the AC compressor. The reason we put it there is it plugs right in, it uses the stock AC lines, it doesn't smack the upper control arm on the passenger side if you were to relocate it on the other side. If you insist on having the XD box with the LS, then you're going to have to relocate that compressor to the other side. We have used mostly two types of mounts. Some guys can squeeze the factory compressor in there, but you're really tight to the frame. The fittings aren't as universal, and unless you have a significant lift, you're going to smack that upper control arm bracket. We've used the Dirty Dingo's 7 Series sanding compressors. They're a smaller diameter, but in a 2-door JK or even a 4-door JK that's not in Vegas, they do just fine. Remember, the size of the compressor will determine how much cooling it can put out. What we find is it'll cool a 4-door JK fine, it just takes longer to cool it down. It doesn't have the capacity of the larger compressors. The other option is to go with Doug, what's their name? It'll come to me. I want to say Doug Thorley, but they used to make headers. I used to work with them. Anyway, I'll post it up because I can't remember the name, but they make a mount for the 5 Series sand-in, which has plenty of displacement for a JK. Getting back to the XD box, if you're running the XD box, you want to run it for quick steering, like in a pre-runner. You got 37-inch tires, which is just a little bit too much for the stock steering system. So you want that heavy-duty gearbox with a heavy-duty sector shaft. Now remember, this is going to put more stress on your frame, and there were spreader bars available and braces. this is going to put more stress on your drag link and your spindle. So just by getting an XD box does not mean you have heavy duty steering. It means you have a heavy duty steering box. In my opinion, if you're going to go 37-inch plus tires, you might as well look into a Ram. You can get a small Ram, like the Redneck Ram setup, which is pretty much minimal that you can get away with on 37s. But if you go with a bigger setup that have a heavy duty pump, like the PSC setup or the AGR or the Howe, and you run a Ram that goes between the axle housing and the tie rod, all your stress is taken up right there. Your steering gearbox is essentially a control valve, so you don't need an XD box. Why do you need a heavy-duty XD box if you got a Ram taking all the stress? It puts less stress on everything else too, including your drag link. So keep that in mind, because I get a lot of guys that call and they got a Ram with an XD box, and we just simply take the XD box off and put the billet PSC box on. PSC sells their standard gearbox for the JK, which is about the same size as a stock gearbox. It's just supposed to be a higher quality. Way back in the day, PSC ported their gearboxes towards the back of the box, or towards where the steering shaft goes in, and they aimed straight out at the engine. And while that was great with the 3.8, once we went to the larger engines, and that's the Hemi or the V8 or whatever, that it would aim right into the engine. So we requested that they port the box up front, which is what they do now for us and pretty much everybody else. If you're going to run PSC with our setup, you can buy the standard JK steering setup from PSC. Don't buy the GM setup. That starts getting real messy. I know they have the LS3 setup and some other things that other shops have pioneered, but we want to stay as true as we can to the JK. So just go out and buy the stock JK setup. Everything. The gearbox, the hoses, the pump, and it's all going to bolt onto our brackets and work with our kit. Let's talk about some of the options on the PSC steering. First being the pulley. The size of the pulley will determine how much volume your pump is going to pump. If you have larger tires like 40s and up, get the smaller pulley. I do believe it's about 5 inches. Just ask them for the overdrive pulley. If you're running smaller tires, let's say 35s or even 37s, most of the time you can get away with a large pulley, which I do believe is about 6 inches. Either way, they will set that up for you. Here's something to consider. The 3.6 and the 3.8 idle at about 700 RPM. The LSs will idle at 500 to 600 RPM, and LTs can idle as low as 400 RPM. So you need to have that overdrive pulley to keep the volume going at low speed. Always get the anti-splash valve. Now, years ago, PSC did not run a sealed system. They just had a hopper with a hose coming out of it, or a piss tube as I call it. And if the fluid got aerated, you sucked air in somewhere, it's going to expand that fluid and it's just going to piss out. And that happened a lot, mostly with the Pentastar engines because they really rev. What some of the other power steering companies and the stock Jeep power steering reservoir did is they sealed the system. They ran a cap that had a few PSI, or held a few PSI of pressure. And by doing that, they sealed the system. And we saw much less problem with the aeration of the fluid and the whining and all that. So get the anti-splash valve is what they call it. It's a little expensive for what it is. I think it's adjustable, but all it really does is holds pressure in the system, and I highly recommend that. When you set up your Ram, make sure the geometry is right. You don't want to have more steering in one direction than the other. In the old days, they used to ask us to measure the travel, like you would turn it lock to lock and measure the distance that the tie rod traveled. They don't really do that anymore. You just tell them what axle you have, and they kind of tell you what Ram you need. Most of us are going to be running about a 1.5 inch Ram, and the size of the Ram will determine how much power it has and how fast it is. The benefit of the smaller Ram is that it moves quicker. The downside of the smaller Ram is it doesn't have as much power. The benefit of a 1 3/4 inch Ram is it has more power. So at low speed with 43-inch tires, you're going to have better steering, but the steering is going to be slower. So everything's a trade-off. The travel of the Ram, the diameter of the Ram, the volume of the power steering pump. Talk to the guys over at PSC or whoever you're going to buy your setup from, and they'll help you set that up. But we just stopped and got gas. We got 16.88 miles to the gallon. I actually think it's closer to 17 because when I filled up, I didn't fill the tank up. The gas here is so expensive that they limit you to $75 at some stations, and that's where it ended up. So I think we got about 17 miles to the gallon, which isn't bad. I'll bet with some creative gearing and some low friction tires, we could do better than that with this JK. Let's take a quick look at torque, because it is one of my favorite apps. And if you look on the left side, those are long-term fuel trims, and you guys know I talk about those a lot. These are running too fat. I like to put a few miles on the vehicle, let the engine seal before I set those. And this is a pretty much out-of-the-box tune. We haven't really modified it. What we're looking at here is about 10% too rich. When you see negative 13, negative 14, that means it's pulling that much fuel out to reach the goal of stoichiometric based on the current operating system. So we're going to correct that with airflow calibration changes. That'll tighten our fuel trims up. Now we are going 80 miles an hour and we are going up some of these grades. So when we get under a load, we're right on the verge of going into performance enrichment. And we've talked about that. When you see those lines flatline to the top, that's performance enrichment. When you see them flatline on the bottom, that's going lean, like a deceleration fuel cutoff. We're not seeing any knock retard, which basically tells me we could kick a little bit more timing in this, which I am, and that's going to improve our economy too. See, we're running in the high 13s. Now, notice that the voltage says CM. That's control module voltage. So that's what the computer is seeing after all the voltage drops. If you were to test this at the battery, it would probably be about 0.2 higher. We'd be pushing 14 volts at the battery. You can see our trans temp staying cool, and our coolant temp's running in the 220s, 218, 219, and I get guys call me all the time, my car's overheating, my Jeep's overheating. I say, what are you running at? I'm running at 212. Well, in the old days when we ran 180 thermostats, 212 may have been warm, but today these engines like to run between 200 and 230. That's where they're designed to run. GM doesn't really wind the fan up until about 226 degrees. Now it's cold out right now. I don't know what it is. It's 47 out. So I don't have the air conditioning on. The air conditioning will override the coolant temp on the fan. So if your AC pressure goes high, it'll wind the fan up and that will bring your coolant temp down. But because it's cold outside, the air conditioning's not on, the trans temp is low, and the intake temp is low, that means this fan is basically off. And what you're seeing right now is natural airflow through the grill, cooling this engine. Going up the hills, I'm hitting about 220. Going down the hills, I'm going down to 205, 200, which is perfectly normal. There's no reason to drive the fan if you don't have to. Now, if this Jeep had all sorts of grill obstructions like lights, light bars, license plates, winches, and all that, you would see that fan winding up just to keep the engine cool. But as long as you're under about 226, that means that the fan isn't running. Something else I check is on this trip, we've set all the monitors except for one, the O2 sensor. That's a little bit unusual. Usually the O2 will set before the evap. We literally started this Jeep up, drove it around the block a few times, then I got into it and headed out to Salt Lake. So it only has a couple of drive cycles on it. And it does take what are called drive cycles to get monitors to set. Every manufacturer publishes their drive cycle, but essentially you have to get into it and start it from a cold start. GM has some pretty strict cold start monitoring, and most of the manufacturers do today. Essentially, the intake air temp and the coolant temp have to be below about 90 degrees, and they have to be within 11 degrees of each other. That can be tough when it's 100 degrees in Vegas at night, and you have to get the engine down below 90. We put ice packs on it with fans. And then as you drive the vehicle, there's different tests, TIDs, MIDs, and what they do is they monitor each system, and there's codependent tests. So sometimes the evap won't set until something else sets. There's minimum and maximums, and if they go outside of those ranges, that test won't set, or it might even set a fault. Now, I do know that this engine is running a little bit fat, and that could be what's affecting this O2 sensor monitor, because the O2 sensors have a median voltage. These are narrowband O2s, so they like to run about 0.450 volts. Now, 0.450 volts is stoichiometric. However, we're not running pure gasoline, and remember, pure gasoline is 14.7. We're running some alcohol in our fuel, so we're really running about 14.2. I don't know what the median O2 is, but it's like 0.460 or something like that. So having the airflow fuel trims being out 10 to 15%, that can slow that monitor down from setting. So we're gonna correct that when we get back to the shop and get it as close to zero as we can. let's talk a little bit more about the additional work that went into this Jeep. And I say that because a lot of the Jeeps come in and guys say, hey, how long is it going to take to do my Jeep? And when you get a Jeep like this where the frame is rotted out, we got to change everything over, all the suspension, the steering, the braking systems, it's a lot of work. Other guys have dual S-pods, dual air compressors, roof racks, just a mass of wiring that's a mess because it was done by some shop that didn't know what they were doing. And then they don't really take into account how much labor that is to clean all that stuff up. And they want to know a time frame. So every Jeep is different. So on this one, we bought a brand new frame from Mopar, and when it came in, it looked like crap as usual. So we kind of cleaned it up and repainted it so it looks good. And we also put some rust preventative primer on it because we know where it's going. We're going to be doing a complete build on video, and we did them years ago, but there's been so many advances over the years. We're going to do them again, especially for the LT, so that guys doing this themselves will have a reference. And essentially the first thing we do is we get the Jeep in and we drive it. Now a lot of the Jeeps that we get are not drivable. In fact, we just had one in the shop that was down for 3 years. We had no idea what worked and what didn't work when it was brought in. But for most of the Jeeps that run, one of my guys or I drive it. We check the cruise control, air conditioning, suspension to see if it has death wobble, etc. So after the pre-tear down test drive and inspection is done, we rack it, we drain all the fluids, and we pull the body. My guys can pull a body in about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the Jeep. Now, some Jeeps can take days because they have weld-on roof racks, they have weld-on rock rails, and we do have adapters that we've developed at Motec to go around the weld-on rock rails to allow us to grab the body. In some really rare cases, we will do it from the front, like if you have a full body cage welded into the body through the frame. For the most part, we pull the body and we take an assessment. What do we got? This one was horrible. It had rust everywhere. I mean, literally the frame was turning to dust. If you tried to scrub the frame down to primer it, it would just flake off and you'd go right through to nothing. So it's pretty obvious that we had to replace the frame. We've replaced 3 frames I know of for rust in the last year. Next, we're going to cut the exhaust off and throw it away or recycle the converters. We're going to remove the wiring and all the other piping and lines going to the engine. Of course, we will have drained the coolant, drained the oil, etc. We're going to pull the powertrain out, including the drive shafts, and then we're going to have a clean chassis. We're going to roll that chassis out into the wash bay and power wash it. Once that chassis is dry, our shop manager, Gary's going to look at it. He's going to look at the brake lines, he's going to look at the steering, suspension. A lot of the times the body bolts rot. A lot of the times the body mounts, the isolators are shot. He's going to go over it and see, well, what does this thing need? He'll do the same thing with the body. I'd say about 25% of the time we have to do some cutting and welding on the body or frame, because where the body mounts, where the pickup points are, they will either rot, the bolt will seize, and you can't get it out, and you got to cut the body open to fix it. Once it's clean and inspected, we're going to make a parts list up of everything the thing needs, and then we're going to do the powertrain install. We're going to get the engine and transmission and sling it in there as a combination. We're going to put the transfer case on separately with the body off. We're not going to put the drive shafts in because we get the body on and we measure the shafts with the full weight of the vehicle on it before we determine the length of the shafts. Most of the wiring, fuel lines, power steering lines, air conditioning lines that can be installed will be installed prior to the body being dropped. Now, of course, a lot of the lines, like the upper, the AC lines, have to go up to the body. Same thing with some of the electrical. So we'll do everything that we can prior to dropping the body, then we'll drop the body. And the C300 connector, which is that large lever lock connector up by the radiator on the passenger side, is where most of the signals, electrical signals, go between the body and the chassis. So the C300 connector handles the wheel speed sensor signals. If you ever lose your speedometer, check that connector. It handles the fuel pump and pretty much anything else on the chassis. Now that C300 connector can be troublesome. It has a couple of pins on the lever lock that tend to break off, and if they break off, you need to secure that connector really good or you're going to have problems. Then of course the body's going to go on. We're going to finish the wiring and do our test drives. So about 2 weeks is actually doing the build. If it's a complex build with I can't even tell you how many of them have had really crappy electrical systems lately where we've just ripped them out, redid them, put new S-pods in or Switch Pros or whatever we use, just cleaning the things up, cleaning the batteries up, because a lot of guys will tend to use the stock battery terminals and gang 10 wires onto one terminal, so we'll go to a bus bar terminal. And not only that, I need to warn you that in 2012, Jeep went to an oversized battery terminal. And this can lead to a lot of problems, because if you put an aftermarket battery in, whether it's an Optima, in fact, let me show you here. We're going up this steep hill at high altitude, and look how the O2s have flatlined. That means we're in PE right now. That's performance enrichment. Now we're going to crest this hill, and watch what happens when we crest this hill. As soon as the load comes off, you're going to, and notice that we have no knock retard. That knock retard means that we can crank a little more spark into it. Okay, we've upshifted, but we're still under a load. Now we're in 10th, and there you go. We're starting to switch again. But again, our fuel trims are off here, and we don't have enough spark in this vehicle. So we're going to get that. One good thing I like to see is we're staying in the 140s in the transmission, and the engine isn't even running on the fan. And at 80 miles an hour, that's good to see that the natural airflow is cooling it. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, all the accessories and stuff guys put on. We end up spending just a ton of time cleaning that stuff up. So your 2-week build might be a 4 or 5 week build. Then after the guys are done, I go driving. And I do kind of a short test drive around town, maybe 20, 30 miles, bring it back to the shop, and they do an inspection. They check the fluids, they look for leaks. I tell them, hey, the steering wheel's off center, it's pulling to the right, whatever. And then after we correct all those issues, we take it for an off-road test drive. And you guys all know about the off-road test drive, you've been seeing it. Now you guys have been seeing a trail I've been running for over a decade, actually closer to 2 decades, but I do run a lot of other trails, and I'm going to try to get some video up on those other trails. After the off-road test drive, we're going to bring it back to the shop and do another inspection. We're going to look for leaks, we're going to make sure everything is functioning, air conditioning, cruise control, tap shift, make sure the steering wheel's straight, etc. If that's all good and there's no other issues, then we have the vehicle detailed. So that's kind of the process of how one of these works. Now there are some other builds that don't work that way, and those are one-off builds, like when we're pioneering in the LT1 right now, and I'm happy to say we got the LT1 pretty much fully functional. I think we still have a little to go on the fan, but we did get full transmission control. That means we can support the L8T and the L87, the L84. That's all going to be coming soon. It wasn't cheap, but we do have full module control now. The L87 runs, believe it or not, a serial commanded fan. Now you guys know what a discrete fan is, on off, it's got a relay. Now you know what a pulse width modulated fan is, where it puts out a frequency. Depending on the speed of that frequency will determine the speed of the fan. Well, the L87 has gone to a serial commanded fan, and it's actually a little serial network between the fan and the other controllers. Now the LT7 also changed some other things, like EVAP, fuel control. They're running that through the fuel pump control module now, rather than through the ECM. So it's making things a little bit more complex. I mentioned the L8T, and I want to say a few things about it. The L8T runs a 6L90 transmission. GM did not go to the 8-speed or the 10-speed. I'm not sure why. Maybe they have a lot of confidence in the 6L90, and they know in their heavy-duty truck line, they don't have to keep the same CAFE standards as they do in their light-duty lines. So maybe that slight loss in economy doesn't bother them. In any event, we love the 8 and the 10-speed. They do have an 8L90 and a 10L90, which have proven to be very strong transmissions. So I wouldn't be surprised to see the 8 or the 10-speed in the L8T in the near future. About a year ago, when I talked to my GM guys, they said wait until GM Performance releases the L8T. Then it'll be available as a crate engine right through GM Performance. The prices that we're seeing on L8Ts are really high. The fact that we have to spend a lot of money to unlock the controllers, and from what I was told by GM has made a lot of improvements in that engine. We have waited. And my guy at GM says they're supposed to release the L8T this summer in a GM Performance crate package, which means we're going to have unlocked controllers, which is great. But with all the COVID stuff going on and plants shutting down and supply shortages, we're just not sure. We hope we see it. So we're going to take this Jeep up to the mountain, and we're going to be back with some interesting stuff.